We are joined at the NCSL Legislative Summit by acclaimed presidential historian Doris Kearns Goodwin, a Pulitzer Prize winner and the author of books on Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, the Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys, Lyndon Johnson and Abraham Lincoln. She addressed the summit about the leadership lessons to be learned from Teddy Roosevelt, the subject of her forthcoming book. Welcome, Ms. Goodwin.
Thank you.
What could today's state and national legislators and politicians learn from TR?
Well, I do think, having studied not only TR, but FDR and Abraham Lincoln and LBJ, that there are universal traits that our great leaders share that really are applicable even when the context changes. But in some ways, what makes TR especially relevant is because he began his long storied career in the state legislature. And he often said that the state assembly was the greatest school for him because he came in as this rather wealthy guy. They thought of him as a dude. He looked different from most of the other Irish legislators who were there. He thought he may have been superior to them. And he learned the most important lesson in politics, that he couldn't win by just making speeches and being dramatic and becoming a lone figure in the assembly, that he had to work with the other people who were there. He had to compromise, and he had to figure out what would make the assembly work as a whole. And then he brought that lesson with him through all the rest of his career. And that started when he was 23 years old.
What do you think TR would think of today's political climate?
I think what would worry him a lot about today's political climate is that he did believe that he could mobilize the public, and he was out there with his speeches, but in the end he knew that he had to get a legislature, either a Congress or the state assembly, to come together in a compromising fashion. And I think the whole dysfunction of Washington and the inability from those two sides to get together would sadden him. I also think what would sadden him is that he's the one who coined the phrase, the bully pulpit, meaning that the president has this platform that no one else has to educate the country and to mobilize public opinion on the issues that he cares about. And in some ways, I think that bully pulpit itself has been diminished in our modern age. Before the president even finishes a speech nowadays, suddenly the pundits are on there, sometimes embarrassingly, including myself, tearing down the speech before it's even been delivered. Nobody listens to the speech as a whole in the way that they used to. And then you've got cable network that will have an opposing side to what it was and somebody else being for it. You don't know where the facts are. You've got the attention span of the public being so much less, certainly from the days when Lincoln could be in a debate for 4 hours and people listened every word. So that I think the chance of a president to speak to the country as a whole is certainly still there at critical moments, but it's not the bully pulpit that it was in TR's time.
Your upcoming book will examine the interplay of the politicians and the muckraking press of the day, which aroused the spirit of reform. How's the role of press different in TR's day than it is now?
What was so important about the press in TR's day was that, especially in the magazine world, it's considered really the golden age of crusading journalism. And these magazines, like McClure is one of the magazines I'm writing about, the head of it was this wonderful character who was a genius, manic depressive, crazy, but incredibly brilliant. And he would allow his writers, Ida Tarbell, Ray Baker, William Allen White, Lincoln Steffens, 2 years of research on their subjects, whether it was Standard Oil or railroad abuses or city corruption or food and drug problems, before they even had to write a word. So these pieces were really investigative, fact-based pieces, and then they mobilized people on the basis of facts. Today, so much of the journalistic world has turned to entertainment, and also because of the blogs and the need to be on the internet, even our best journalists, their attention is divided from these longer pieces they might be writing to shorter and shorter and shorter pieces to Twitter in the end. So I think that impact that the journalists had on public policy, even the guys that I'm writing about, many years later, decades later, when they were still alive, look back at that first decade of the 20th century when they had such a close relationship with TR, even though they fought with each other, and produced real regulatory legislation that lasted, as the happiest time of their life, because they were part of the country's progress, not simply journalists.
Similarly, as a historian, what do you make of the similarities between TR's era and today? At the turn of the century, 1% of the people owned 99% of the wealth. There were a lot of mergers and big companies swallowing little ones.
It's astonishing. I mean, sometimes when I'm back at the turn of the 20th century, I think, my God, this is today. It sounds so much like the problems of today, because what happened at that time, we were coming out of the industrial order, having just really the revolution been established. Before that time, wealthy people living in a farm community might have a house on top of a hill. But now all of a sudden you've got this enormous wealth that's been generated by these giant corporations. People are living in slums side by side, excuse me, with these huge mansions. And you do have a sense of people that there's a disparity of income. Labor has all sorts of needs that are not being met. And people are unaware of the importance of the federal government being able to regulate and change things. The income tax had been voted down by the Supreme Court. Early labor legislation on minimum wage and maximum hours had to be fought tooth and nail. And it does remind me so much of today. I mean, especially there's a moment in 1907 where it's called the 1907 panic that produces a recession. It was a quite serious economic problem. And what caused it, in part? Well, banks were using depositors' money to speculate on the copper market. And one bank failed, and then another bank failed. And so you feel sometimes like we are fighting this whole question over and over again of how much government regulation is necessary in order to deal with the public's needs and protect the public, how much is too much that stifles private enterprise. And here in the turn of the 20th century, it's the beginning of that huge fight, because laissez-faire was so much the ideology, but they begin to get that first regulation through. And then you see it again in the New Deal, you see it again in the 60s, and the fight is still there now as to what that choice should be between private enterprise and government regulation.
President Obama was an admirer of your book, Team of Rivals, and he brought his chief rival, Hillary Clinton, as well as Republican Robert Gates, into his administration. Given today's contentious political climate, is it possible for anything resembling a team of rivals to arise again?
I think it's much harder than it was. I mean, when you think about the contentiousness of the 1850s, of course, that's even worse than today, when you have people hitting each other over the head in the Congress and almost killing each other on the Senate floor. But nonetheless, there was a sense in the old days that factions would try to come together and work out their differences. And you didn't have the press, certainly not in the 1860s, telling what everybody knew about the feelings that everyone had about each other. Even up to FDR's presidency, he brought in two top Republicans on the eve of World War II, Stimson and Knox, into his cabinet. They didn't agree with him about the New Deal at all, but he knew they agreed with him about the importance of the Allied cause against Hitler. Today, you always get a token Republican in a Democratic administration or vice versa, but you don't get a bunch of them in a certain sense, because I think they would be felt as traitors in their own party if they joined the administration of another party. So it's much harder today because those party lines have congealed, and we saw a little bit of it in the beginning of the Obama administration, but my guess, sadly, is it's going to be harder and harder as we go on from here.
After the Supreme Court ruling on health care, you tweeted two quotes from Lincoln. Speaking of quick journalism.
Yes, sir.
The quotes are, "Public sentiment is everything. With public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed." Followed by, "Consequently, he who molds public sentiment goes deeper than he who enacts statutes or pronounces decisions." Why did those two come so quickly to mind after the decision?
Because what I was thinking of was that even though the Supreme Court had decided at that moment that the health care law would not be repealed, that it was constitutional, there still remained the battle to persuade the public that this was a law that benefited them. And I think that's what Lincoln meant, that if you've got something big that's going to affect people, the most important thing is for them to understand it. And even now we still see in the public opinion polls that people still are not sure of what the provisions are. They're still not happy with this health care bill. And if it's going to remain on the books and not be repealed by another administration, that educational challenge is what the Obama administration faced, and that's what I meant at that moment. They may have won that first battle, but the larger battle was in the public, to get them to understand and want this bill if it's going to stay alive.
What can you tell us about the Lincoln movie based on Team of Rivals?
Well, it's coming out on November 9th, and Daniel Day-Lewis is playing Lincoln. And I just saw a picture the other day of him dressed up, the first picture they really put forward. It is uncanny. It looks so much like Lincoln, but more importantly, he's a fabulous actor. And it's based on the last months of Lincoln's life, and it's mostly about the 13th Amendment and the fight to get the 13th Amendment passed, so it's got a real drama to it. And Tommy Lee Jones is in it in an incredible way, Sally Field. I think it's going to be really great. Tony Kushner wrote the script.
Were you on the set at all?
I was on the set in Richmond. I went down to Richmond, Virginia, and spent a couple days. They were in the Capitol in Richmond, which was being used as the U.S. Capitol. And there was something wonderful about the fact that Richmond opened its doors so generously to this movie about Lincoln, when only 15 years or so ago, there was a big fight about putting a Lincoln statue on the street where all the great Southern generals were sitting. So it shows that that south-north thing, I think, is healing in a lot of ways, more than other parts of our country are.
You've said that the country needs to make up its mind about how big government ought to be. How big do you think it should be?
As big as it's needed to be, I suppose. What Lincoln would say, and he had the best argument about it, is that the government should do for the people what they cannot do for themselves. And I think you should say the federal government should do for the country what state and local governments cannot do for themselves. State should do for the state what local governments can. I mean, the lowest possible place where it can work is the best, obviously. That's what the federal system is all about. But obviously there are certain functions, whether they are military functions or functions that have to do with Social Security or things that can only be done at certain levels that you need to carry out. But I think at the same time, this election is going to be very much about what should that role of government be. I mean, it's been a continuing challenge from the beginning, from Jefferson and Hamilton. So it's a continuing strain in our nation's life. But to figure out how much government we need without stifling the private enterprise remains a huge problem for us. And a good one. I mean, a good one that we should be fighting about.
I can't let you go without talking about the Red Sox.
Oh, that's so mean.
Maybe we should apologize for bringing you to Chicago. We have to watch the White Sox on their way to winning a division, maybe. And even worse, Kevin Youkilis playing third base and batting cleanup. You're a huge Red Sox fan, a baseball fan. How does being a baseball fan affect the work that you do as a historian? And
I mean, it really is huge for me, only because I think in some ways I learned to love history through learning to love baseball. I mean, from those days when I was only 6 years old and my father taught me that mysterious art of how to keep score at baseball games, so when he came home at night I could record for him the history of that afternoon's Brooklyn Dodger game was my original love. It makes you think there's something magic about history, even if it's just 4 hours old, to keep your father's attention. And I think I even learned the narrative art from those nightly sessions, because at first I would blurt out, "The Dodgers won," or "The Dodgers lost," which took the drama of this 2-hour telling away. So I finally learned you had to tell a story from beginning to middle to end. And that's what history is. It's storytelling. And you want to tell it without knowing ahead of time what's happened. So, in fact, Barbara Tuchman, the great historian, once said, if you're writing about a war even, you have to imagine to yourself you do not know how that war ended. So you can carry your reader with you every step along the way from beginning to middle to end. So I just learned that instinctively as a kid, keeping my father's attention. But now I think what it means is just, it means you're part of a city. I mean, Boston's going through the sadness of the Red Sox collapse altogether, so you feel this community thing, just as when we won in '04. I mean, it was worth all those years of sadness to have that final first World Series victory. And the town felt connected. Every city feels connected to its. That's what's so great about baseball, from all different people's jobs, different classes of people. And it's a great avocation. I care too much about it because I've been waking up sad many mornings this summer. And the older I get, I realized I would trade if the Red Sox had done well all year and then dramatically lost in a playoff game. I'd be much happier than this, because this means that I'm sad most of the summer. Even if they have a run in September and they make it into the playoffs, I will not be as happy as I would have been if they were the other way around. But that's maturity. I think most people would say, no, you want the final victory. I want the day-to-day happiness.
Great. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're so welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you.